The restraint is over. President Trump on a tear this morning, defending Brett Kavanaugh and now going after his accuser, Christine Blasey Ford, saying last hour his Supreme Court pick is, quote, under assault by radical Dems. If the attack on Dr. Ford was as bad as she says, charges would have been immediately filed by either her or her loving parents. I ask that she bring those filings forward. He adds, the radical left lawyers want the FBI to get involved now. Why didn't someone call the FBI 36 years ago? All of this coming as lawyers for Ford, who claims that Kavanaugh sexually assaulted her in high school, are now negotiating her terms to testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee. We are learning more about the deal breakers on both sides for that testimony. More on that in just a moment. But first, I want to get right to Abby Phillip. She is at the White House here. I mean, this is quite a truly remarkable change in tone by the president, directly attacking Ford, Kavanaugh's accuser here. What happened?
That's right, Jim. This is a big shift from where he was at the beginning of this week when President Trump was focusing his remarks on Brett Kavanaugh being a good person, someone that he stands by, and declining to directly attack his accuser. But that has all changed. In the last 24 hours, President Trump has now launched a new line of attack, questioning why Christine Blasey Ford didn't come forward 36 years ago when she was 15 years old, according to her, and report this incident, this alleged incident, to the FBI. Now, President Trump's aides have been relieved for the last several days that he hadn't gone this far. And now he's doing exactly what I think many of them had hoped that he would restrain from doing. And this is in part because what we've seen over the last several days is a shift in the dynamics here. At the beginning of the week, the White House was blindsided when Christine Blasey Ford's identity was revealed in the Washington Post. And they chose to go toward a tactic that would focus on making sure that she was heard in the forum of a hearing. But now that Blasey Ford has expressed some reservations about appearing in a certain kind of context, the White House has changed their strategy. We've even had aides in the last day or so questioning whether or not this might be a case of mistaken identity, whether she might be mistaking Kavanaugh for someone else. So, Jim, this is a different strategy that we're seeing, but the president himself questioning why a victim might not have come forward when they were 15 years old. I think you're going to see a lot of Republicans questioning whether that is the right tactic for dealing with this next phase of the dynamics between Kavanaugh and his accuser, Jim.
Yeah, no doubt. Abby Phillip at the White House, thanks very much. Ford's attorneys have set out a non-starter for her, that being testifying by Monday. But we're learning right now that the GOP has its own non-starters on Ford's request. A senior GOP staffer telling me that one, subpoenaing other witnesses, including Mark Judge. The Senate does not take subpoena requests from witnesses, I'm told. Two, her request that Kavanaugh testify first. Also a non-starter that Ford should testify first so that Kavanaugh would have an opportunity to respond. That's the view of a senior GOP staffer. I want to go now to Manu Raju, who is on Capitol Hill here. Manu, so clearly you have some differences there. That said, the two sides are talking, and is it correct to say they seem to be moving closer to an agreement about testimony next week?
I think it's very likely that they could reach an agreement. The real only red line that the Ford camp drew last night was that Monday hearing. They did not want to do this on Monday. And also, they wanted to make it very clear that she would not be in the same room as Brett Kavanaugh at the same time. And to ensure that her safety was accounted for. That was really about it in terms of red lines that the Ford camp drew. They did raise those other issues that you referred to, Jim, including ensuring that Kavanaugh testifies first. He's asking if that were a possibility, and subpoenaing other outside witnesses like Mark Judge, the alleged witness of this incident that occurred in the early 1980s. Those issues were more asks than they were demands. So the Republicans clearly are not going to go for that. So the question is, where do they go from here? One of the things in an email that we have seen from Ford's attorney that went over to the Senate Judiciary Committee this morning, they reiterated their concern about outside counsels questioning the senators, questioning Ford next week. That was one of the issues that was raised during last evening's phone call. Deborah Katz, who is the attorney for Christine Blasey Ford, raised concerns about how this could turn into a trial-like atmosphere if that outside counsel were to be questioning. So they want the senators to do that themselves. Now, I'm told that Chuck Grassley, the Senate Judiciary Committee chairman, and the Majority Leader Mitch McConnell have had discussions about those requests, and member-level discussions are going to continue today until they probably will respond at some point later today. So we'll see if they reach some sort of resolution, especially on that hearing date. She's suggested possibly next Thursday. We'll see the Republicans go for that, and if they agree to the other things that she suggested, and if the Ford camp agrees. But clearly, some movement after days of not talking, a sign that a hearing probably will take place, Jim.
Manu Raju on the Hill, thanks very much. Joining me now to discuss all this, and there is a lot to discuss. Developments this morning, Shan Wu, CNN legal analyst, Jackie Kucinich, CNN political analyst, and Malika Henderson, CNN senior political reporter. Let's start for a moment to set aside the negotiations for the testimony, but let's start with the president's clear change in tack here. Our colleague Caitlin Collins was reporting just in the last few hours that the president had been bragging in recent days about the positive coverage of his restrained response. The policy of restraint is over.
Yes, it's over, and we see on these the tweets that he sent out this morning that the gloves are off at this point. I think the hope for this White House was, in some ways, to rush this, right, so that the president could have a sort of contained and small window where he had to contain himself and not go off on the victim, or the alleged victim, as he's doing now. You saw Kellyanne Conway a couple of days ago basically say, we should hear her out. Right. She doesn't deserve to be criticized. She doesn't deserve to be condemned. Let's hear her out. And you see even she's sort of changing her strategy a bit here, maybe saying she was confused or mixed up, mistaken identity, alluding to the fact that maybe she's part of some sort of Democratic cabal or Democratic conspiracy to take Judge Kavanaugh down. So we'll see what happens. I mean, the thing about the president is once he goes here with these tweets, he usually keeps going, right? I mean, there's no pullback once he gets out there.
And there have already been a couple this morning in that lane.
And the political risk here. Initially, there was some concern about him alienating two female Republican senators who are the key, Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, who are two of the key votes on this nominee. They're not in the Judiciary Committee, but they are very important to getting him off the floor of the U.S. Senate. And looking more broadly, what the president is doing is reminding suburban women who might be on the fence why they don't like the president. It's this sort of language.
Shen, the president's essential accusation here is that Ford's accusation is less credible because she didn't go to the FBI 36 years ago when she was a 15-year-old, or her parents didn't. The president mentions her loving parents there. In your past, you have investigated sex crimes. Explain why that accusation is not a fair one.
His accusation is exactly why they need expert testimony on the Hill, talking about the real life experiences of survivors, how the trauma affects their reporting. It is very, very common for survivors to report late and for disclosures to come out gradually, particularly in young victims. And she was only 15 at the time, so it makes perfect sense that she would have been embarrassed, frightened, not have gone forward, as she's already said. And this is precisely why they need some information to educate the senators and to educate the American public. If the senators want to not ask embarrassingly ignorant questions, they need to have some expert testimony first.
Let's now talk about the other issues, the testimony, and I suppose the two key folks are going to be Kavanaugh and Ford. As of yesterday, it looked like it just may not happen. Right. The two sides were so far apart. The Senate GOP was saying they hadn't even heard from her, but they had these conversations last night. Based on what you're seeing here, even though there are still key differences, does it look to you like they're going to be sitting down at a table next week?
Yeah, I mean, this thing has moved so fast, and in some ways, in so many different directions, it's always hard to predict. But it looks likely that this is going to happen tomorrow. The fact that there is communication, because for days there hadn't been communication. The Judiciary Committee essentially set a date before they even were in communication with the woman and her lawyer. So jumping the gun a bit there, and now they're trying to figure out what the terms are. There's some some disagreement there. But it seems like for her, the main sort of non-starter is it being on Monday. And of course, Judge Kavanaugh has said he plans to be there on Monday. Is he there alone and she comes later on Thursday? Which again would be different from what they want, because they want her to go first, the Judiciary Committee to go for, they want her to go first and then him to go second. But I think we're going to see this next week, and my goodness, what a momentous thing it will be when it happens.
And Jackie, so you get to that point, let's say, and the two sit down. I mean, the real challenge begins then, you might even say, because then senators presented, it seems, with two contradictory accounts from two people who have credibility here, right? I mean, some credibility. They've had many people attesting to their credibility, Kavanaugh and Ford. That still leaves senators in quite a difficult position on this vote.
It's going to really matter how they approach this, how they ask the questions, how they treat both Kavanaugh and Professor Blasey, because there is a political risk, and about how they do approach this. And will this devolve into a he said, she said? Perhaps it will. But there is some fear on the Republican side that Professor Blasey does come off as a very credible individual. We have not heard her speak yet. We've read, obviously, her interview with the Washington Post, but she hasn't appeared in public yet.
So Sean, there's a political timeline here. Let's be frank. I mean, and the Republicans have set this timeline with their own interests at heart. They want to seat this judge before midterm elections and ideally, before the October 1st date when the Supreme Court sits down. Now, my understanding, though, is he would not have to be seated by then. Let's presume he gets through. Right. He could be seated after that date. They could confirm him afterwards, and he can get in and then consider these other issues, whatever the issues coming before the court.
No, that's right. Yeah, there's no hard deadline. He has to start the term. I mean, he could come in later.
Okay, fair enough. Right, yeah. So looking as a prosecutor, as a lawyer, when you look at the requests that Ford has made here, do they strike you as reasonable requests? Beyond the timing, the conditions, witnesses, for instance?
Those are very reasonable requests. And again, you know, if the senators are concerned about having to question the vacuum, they should encourage some investigation. That way they have some context, they have some facts that they can question about. I think the insistence that the judge go first, that's probably a little bit of strategy. They're willing to negotiate that away. It would make sense for him to be responding to what he hears. But the witnesses certainly, and this notion that witnesses can't call for the Senate to subpoena, that's just nonsense. That's pro forma. I mean, they're suggesting people, and the senators should say, yes, these would be very helpful to hear from. The other person in the room, it would be good to have them there.
There's some new polling out on public support for Brett Kavanaugh. Let's put that up on the screen, because it was never particularly hot, and now it's declined. Look at those opposed, from 29% opposing to 38%, almost 10 points there. Support about the same, but don't know. The undecideds, in effect, have switched against it. Now, you might say the only poll that really matters is the Senate, because they have the power to confirm. But do these public support figures matter to senators when they face this decision?
You know, maybe a few of them. State by state, the ones who we've been looking at, obviously Murkowski and Collins and those red state Democrats, the 3 or 4 of them who we don't know who've decided yet. But it's clear that the numbers you said, people hadn't really formed an opinion yet, 30% or so, 40% or so. And now, because of this new information, there's a change. And this is very different. I mean, he is a darling of conservative elites in D.C. The general public, even sort of Trump voters, Trump base voters, don't really know who he is, but they do want a conservative Supreme Court. And Trump has talked about this idea that that's why he won the presidency.
And what both sides have tried to have politicized this in a lot of ways. I think just, you know, seeing and talking to people over the last couple of days, a lot of women, Republican, Democrat women, see themselves in Dr. Blasey's, or I'm sorry, excuse me, Professor Blasey's story, because and you've seen women come forward in a way, even on Twitter, telling their stories and sharing their stories, because in a way she's made it okay, and as a way to either support her and support each other. So we can't ignore the fact that this is bigger, and that because of that, it does create a more complicated field for Republicans going into this.